The Whistle and the War. Scott Foster, the NBA's most controversial figure. The unspoken truce that had long existed between the NBA's elite players and its officiating core has finally and irreparably shattered. LeBron James, a man renowned for his composure and calculated restraint, has reached his breaking point, and his crosshairs are locked squarely on referee Scott Foster. Yet the king finds himself far from alone in this confrontation. A brotherhood of basketball's greatest names has begun speaking the unspeakable, tearing back the curtain on the man they believe has corrupted the very sport that made them legends. James Harden, typically measured in his public statements, has gone on record demanding Foster be barred from entering arenas altogether. Chris Paul's grievance cuts even deeper, a wound so personal it transcends the sport itself, a years-long grudge rooted in something no foul call or playoff loss could fully explain. Even the commentators who occupy the broadcast booth, typically careful to protect the league's image, can no longer look away. They are saying it plainly. Scott Foster has crossed a line and something has to give. But to truly understand this eruption, you have to follow the thread all the way down, because the rabbit hole runs far darker than most fans could ever imagine, snaking through prison sentences, gambling rings, and the most damaging officiating scandal in American professional sports history. The moment that brought everything to a boil happened on the night of May 20th, 2023, during Game 3 of the Western Conference Finals between the Los Angeles Lakers and the Denver Nuggets. In every sport, there exists that rare, crystallizing instant where two worlds, the players and the officials, collide with a force that rattles everything around them. That collision arrived in flesh and bone, leaving the NBA's most polarizing official bleeding and uttering words that set the internet ablaze. With roughly a minute left in the second quarter, LeBron was doing what he had spent 2 decades perfecting. Reading the defense, commanding the floor, operating like a machine built for basketball. He turned briefly to collect a pass from D'Angelo Russell, and in that single blind moment, his shoulder drove full force into the face of crew chief Scott Foster. The whistle Foster was holding became an unintentional weapon, jamming directly into his lip on impact. LeBron immediately threw his hands up, insisting he never saw the stripes. On the Lakers bench, Austin Reeves cracked a nervous joke about a technical foul, but the laughter that followed was uneasy. Every soul in that arena, from the courtside seats to the upper deck, felt the gravity of what had just occurred. The face of the franchise had drawn blood from the face of everything players despise about officiating. Foster's reaction, however, is what transformed a physical incident into something far more loaded. After brief apologies were exchanged and LeBron explained he had been locked into sprint mode, Foster brushed off the collision, but then delivered a line that froze the sports world in place. "You've been wanting to do that for 25 years, he said. A smirk wrapped around words that sounded like banter but landed like a confession. On the surface, it read as the kind of sharp-tongued exchange you might expect between two veterans who had shared the hardwood since 2003. But those words, dripping from a bloody lip, didn't evaporate into the arena air. They ignited a firestorm that continues to burn. Because that quip wasn't really a joke. It was an acknowledgement of something the basketball world had whispered for decades. That the players, the men who fill arenas and generate billions, have desperately wanted Foster gone. The clip exploded across the internet, amassing millions of views almost instantly. The memes were merciless, the conspiracy theories multiplied overnight, and a critical question began trending everywhere. Not whether LeBron's hit was deliberate, but why so many fans were openly rooting for a referee to get hurt. The answer to that question requires a deep understanding of who Scott Foster actually is. Foster has been blowing the whistle in the NBA since the 1994-95 season, and his resume is, by any objective measure, extraordinary. By the 2024 season, he had officiated more than 1,600 regular season games, 263 playoff contests, and 26 finals games. He holds the active record for playoff appearances and has worked an astonishing 16 consecutive NBA finals. To the league's front office, he is the ultimate closer, the official you assign when the stakes are highest and the margin for error is zero. But the players, the men whose careers and legacies are shaped by what happens on that floor, tell an entirely different story. In anonymous surveys, conducted by the LA Times and The Athletic, Foster wasn't simply ranked poorly. He was voted the single worst referee in the entire league. Not runner-up. Dead last. In 2023 alone, a full quarter of NBA players singled him out by name. The gap between how the league views Foster and how the players experience him isn't just wide. It's a canyon. And that canyon is exactly where the resentment festered into the open war we're witnessing today. James Harden offered one of the most damning public indictments, choosing after a painful 2019 loss to call Foster out by name, labeling him rude, arrogant, and fundamentally impossible to engage with. Harden painted a picture of a referee who kills the rhythm of the game by refusing to maintain the kind of honest dialogue that keeps competition from descending into chaos. When communication between players and officials breaks down, he argued, so does the integrity of everything the sport is built upon. Harden then went further than any active superstar had gone before. He looked directly into the camera and publicly demanded that Foster be prohibited from officiating his team's games. It was a declaration of war, plain and simple. And Harden is far from alone. The list of stars who have openly clashed with Foster reads like a Hall of Fame ballot. Chris Paul, Paul Pierce, Kyle Lowry, Damian Lillard, and Rudy Gobert, among others. Gobert was fined $100,000 in 2024 for flashing a money sign gesture at Foster midgame. A wordless but unmistakable accusation that the officiating was being dictated by Vegas rather than the rulebook. Kelly Oubre Jr. went even further, physically confronting Foster on the court and screaming, "You're a horrible ref," directly into his face, later absorbing the fine without a second thought, treating it as the price of speaking an inconvenient truth. Then there is LeBron James himself, a man who has waged a two-decade battle against what he sees as a broken system, with Foster increasingly becoming its most recognizable symbol. A gut-wrenching January 2023 loss to the Boston Celtics brought that tension to its most raw expression. LeBron drove to the basket, absorbed a clear hack across the arm from Jason Tatum on a play that should have ended the game in the Lakers' favor, and heard nothing but silence from the officials. Rather than simply complain, LeBron crumbled, slamming the hardwood in visible anguish, later revealing that an official had looked him directly in the eye and told him either they didn't see it or it wasn't a foul. "It's not making sense to me," he said. "It was frustrating as hell, man. It was breaking him." The NBA's own last 2-minute report subsequently confirmed what everyone watching already knew. It was a foul, and it was missed. The crew chief on the floor that night was Eric Lewis, not Foster. But the fury LeBron felt was never really about one official. It was about the entire apparatus, and Foster sits at the throne of that apparatus. To truly understand why Foster generates such visceral hatred, you have to travel back to 2007 and confront the darkest chapter in American professional sports officiating. Tim Donaghy, a 13-year NBA veteran in stripes, pleaded guilty to federal conspiracy charges, wire fraud, and the leaking of gambling information to organized crime figures with ties to the Gambino crime family. He admitted to betting on his own games and manipulating outcomes to line his pockets, ultimately serving 15 months in federal prison before receiving a lifetime ban from the league. The NBA desperately wanted that story buried. But buried inside it was a detail that refuses to stay quiet. During the precise window of Donaghy's criminal enterprise, between October 2006 and April 2007, phone records revealed that he placed 134 calls to a single colleague, Scott Foster. To put that number in perspective, Donaghy called his own bookie only 126 times during the same period. No other referee in the entire league received more than 13 calls from Donaghy in that span. The calls were brief, clustered suspiciously around Donaghy's conversations with high-stakes gamblers like James Batista, and deeply irregular in their timing. Foster cooperated fully with both the FBI and the NBA's independent investigator, Lawrence Pedowitz, and the official conclusion was that the calls were personal in nature, two old colleagues from the summer leagues of the early 1990s simply keeping in touch, discussing travel logistics and scheduling before texting became the standard. Foster later shrugged it off as simply how people communicated in 2007. No charges were filed. No handcuffs. Scott Foster walked away completely clean, at least legally. But Tim Donaghy refused to simply disappear into obscurity. In his 2009 tell-all memoir, Personal Foul, he alleged that the corruption plaguing officiating ran straight to the marrow, that referees were being deployed as instruments of the league's corporate agenda, protecting marquee players, artificially extending playoff series to generate advertising revenue and manufacturing outcomes that serve the biggest markets. In podcast appearance after podcast appearance, Donaghy has laid out the mechanics of the operation in chilling detail. "I knew what the league wanted called that night," he stated flatly. "I knew how to put a team or a player at an advantage or a disadvantage." His most revealing admission was that no call ever had to be outright wrong. The manipulation came in knowing which correct calls to make, and when to make them in ways that quietly buried a team under a deficit they couldn't escape. When pressed on which officials the league trusted most for its highest stakes moments, the clutch assignments where legacies are forged and revenue is maximized, Donaghy didn't speak in vague generalities. He named names. After mentioning Dick Bavetta, he zeroed in on a pattern that implicated Foster directly. "It feels like Foster and Mark Davis are getting tapped for a lot of these games. Davis looks like the go-to for Game 6s, but Foster seems to own Game 7. Game 7. The kill floor, the ultimate do-or-die spectacle on the NBA calendar. And the raw data appears to support the allegation in a way that is genuinely difficult to explain away. Since 2008, teams trailing 3-1 or 3-2 in a playoff series have won approximately 70% of the games officiated by Foster, compared to the league-wide baseline of 35 to 40%. That statistical anomaly is the foundation of Foster's most notorious reputation. The extender, the referee the league deploys when it needs one more gate, one more primetime broadcast, one more night of maximum revenue. In fairness, a 2025 Reddit analysis found that Foster's extender numbers had since regressed to 50%, falling in line with the statistical average. A separate study by analyst Owen Phillips concluded that while Foster calls 0.3 more fouls per 100 possessions than his peers, the distribution of those fouls isn't dramatically skewed against any particular team or player. But no spreadsheet can measure the psychological weight of a decade's worth of accumulated grievances. And in the NBA, perception does not merely influence reality. It is reality. No relationship in the entire Foster saga illustrates this more starkly than his war with Chris Paul. In playoff games officiated by Foster, Paul's teams carry a record of 3 wins and 17 losses, including a staggering run of 13 consecutive defeats. Without Foster on the floor, Paul's playoff winning percentage sits at a solid 56.4%. With him, it collapses to a barely there 10.5%. Paul has never been shy about the animosity, confirming publicly that their conflict is deeply personal. "We had a situation a few years back, and yeah, it is personal. You feel me?" The origins of that situation, according to Gilbert Arenas, who unpacked it in detail on his podcast, trace back to a post-game parking area where Foster allegedly leaned on his car horn and screamed profanities at Paul's young son, Lil Chris, who was simply playing around in the tunnel. A grown man, a senior NBA official, allegedly directing obscenities at a child from the safety of his vehicle. From that moment forward, whatever fragile professional relationship had existed between Paul and Foster was reduced to ash. But Arenas went further, describing how Foster would reportedly approach Paul before major playoff games and taunt him about his inability to win in Foster's presence, including an alleged pregame jab before a Spurs series. "Hey, you know you haven't won a closeout game with me yet." A referee using his own whistle as psychological leverage against a player before the opening tip is not a minor breach of conduct. It is, as Arenas framed it, an existential crisis for the sport's integrity. "You look at me and mentally you know you cannot beat me," Foster allegedly conveyed. And in doing so, Arenas argued, he had effectively told the entire Phoenix Suns organization they were already defeated before a single point was scored. The 2021 NBA Finals brought this dynamic into its most dramatic and public expression. With Paul's Suns holding a 2-game series lead over the Milwaukee Bucks, the league introduced Foster into the officiating rotation for Game 3. The reaction in Las Vegas was immediate and seismic. According to Arenas, nearly every bettor in America pivoted instantly to the Bucks, taking them at -40. The Suns were subsequently blown out by 20 points. Foster returned again for Game 6. When the mere announcement of a referee assignment triggers a mass movement of gambling money, when a Change.org petition demanding a referee's removal gathers thousands of signatures, when a sitting NBA champion openly admits to switching his own wager simply because he saw a specific official's name on the crew sheet, the conversation has moved well beyond complaints about missed calls. It is now a conversation about whether the game itself can be trusted. That conversation leads directly to Boston, and to a second official whose story is, in some ways, even more damning. Eric Lewis spent 19 seasons on the floor, working 1,061 regular season games, 91 playoff contests, and 6 final series. He wasn't just a fixture, he was one of the most consistently deployed officials in the league. Until May 2023, when internet investigators uncovered a shadow Twitter account operating under the alias Blair Cutlift. 0 followers, 0 public presence, used exclusively to argue in the digital mud with fans, particularly Lakers fans who accused him of favoritism toward Boston. The plot thickened catastrophically when those same detectives connected the account to the January 28, 2023 game in which LeBron was hacked by Tatum with no whistle, a game Lewis crew chiefed, and a no-call the league's own last 2-minute report later confirmed was a blown foul. While the outrage poured in online, Lewis's anonymous account was mocking it in real time. Lakers still blaming the refs. Huh? Y'all played the number 1 team and they don't get any credit. By August 30, 2023, Lewis had retired. The investigation was formally closed. But the damage was permanent. Since 2020, when Lewis was assigned to a game, the Boston Celtics went 36-2. A winning percentage so extraordinary, it renders the word coincidence meaningless. Stacked alongside Foster's own numbers, which include a perfect 6-0 record in Celtics games during the 2023-24 season, the pattern forms something far more troubling than an anomaly. Tim Donaghy, predictably, had already seen it coming. Appearing on a podcast before the burner account scandal ever surfaced, he connected Lewis directly to Boston's improbable fortune, noting his record was something like 20-2 when officiating Celtic games. He then broke down why the machinery of favoritism doesn't require envelopes of cash to function. It runs on human nature. Maybe he knows someone off the floor on that team, Donaghy explained, and suddenly they get the benefit of the doubt. That is the anatomy of a fix in its most insidious form. It requires no criminal conspiracy. It grows naturally from an assignment system that rewards referees who generate drama, extend series, and protect revenue streams. Officials who make the right calls at the right moments for the right outcomes get the primetime slots, the finals assignments, the prestige. The system doesn't need to be explicitly corrupt to produce corrupt results. The incentive structure does the work on its own. The league's response to all of it has been, by any measure, remarkable for its audacity. In December 2025, the NBA quietly reinstated Eric Lewis as a G League official. League president Byron Spruill framed it as a progressive path rather than a penalty. A road back into the organization for the man who ran a burner account to mock the same players his calls affected. Meanwhile, Scott Foster continues to work the biggest games on the calendar. During the 2025 Thunder Pacers Finals, Game 4 devolved into a whistle festival featuring 53 foul calls, a number that had coaches, players, and commentators alike questioning the sanity of what they were watching. Rick Carlisle, a veteran coach who has seen virtually everything this league has to offer, looked like a man on the verge of a breakdown. But among the fans, the emotion had shifted from outrage to something quieter and more corrosive: resignation. The growing, bone-deep sense that the outcomes are being shaped by forces operating above the game itself. Kendrick Perkins, a champion who earned his rings in the trenches, captured the collective exhaustion perfectly after Foster ejected Chris Paul in 2023. "Scott Foster has to stop, right?" he said, the weariness saturating every word. "It's not about one bad night. It's about a pattern that's been rotting the floorboards for years. And yet, Foster endures." He absorbed the fallout from 134 phone calls to a convicted match fixer and walked away without a charge. He weathered being voted the absolute worst referee in basketball by the people who know the game most intimately. He shrugged off Change.org petitions, outlasted viral firestorms, and remained untouched even as fans prayed publicly that suspension hoaxes circulating online would turn out to be real. He stands at center court, immovable, Teflon-coated, and apparently permanent. That permanence, Gilbert Arenas argued, is itself the most damning evidence of all. because it places the league in an impossible trap of its own construction. Remove Foster now, and the NBA implicitly validates every conspiracy theory that has been circulating for 20 years. Admit the pattern was real, admit the calls were shaped, and hand Chris Paul a posthumous victory over a system that spent a decade and a half defeating him. But keep Foster in place, and the whispers don't stay whispers. They grow into a roar that no press release or league statement can contain. LeBron James has never called Scott Foster a fixer. Not publicly, not on the record. But his entire legacy has been cast in the shadow of the controversies Foster embodies, shaped and complicated by the questions his presence inevitably raises. And so when LeBron's shoulder crashed into Foster's face on that warm May night in Los Angeles and drew actual blood, something shifted. It wasn't just a physical collision. It was the moment 1,000 fines and 1,000 carefully worded press conferences never managed to produce. For one electric instant, the entire basketball world stopped watching the ball and started watching the whistle. The lights are on now. The question is no longer whether Scott Foster will ever face accountability. The question is whether the NBA possesses the institutional courage to referee itself, to look honestly at the system it has built and acknowledge what it has become. Until that reckoning arrives, every foul call, every technical, every climactic playoff moment will carry the weight of an asterisk that no amount of denial can wash away.